December 17, 2004. The end of an era. The breakup of a star and the team that drafted and raised him. Or you could say,
it's over! It's over, ladies and gentlemen!
Oh, Carter with great hands and strip. Ahead of the back, showtime! Oh, no! Two men on the ball. Hoiberg. Carter with the steal.
Swings it right side. Carter at the foul line. All the way.
Oh, with a right-handed monster jam.
He just posterized Tim Duncan.
Curry looks, steps back, and misses a three. Carter with the rebound. Turnaround. Another one. That's amazing.
Clippers lead 94-92. Carter wide open for the win.
Christie with the block. Muggsy Bogues, give it to Vince. Oh, windmill jam. Jump shot by Vince. Carter for three. It's good.
Flashing the other way is Carter. Oh, my goodness. A 360 whirl-around dunk.
Vince Carter has one of the most complicated legacies of any franchise player. So popular at his peak that the man got voted in as an all-star starter despite only playing 13 games before being announced as third in voting overall for that year. The man missed well over a dozen games between his last game played and the all-star break, and he was third in voting among all all-star players, only falling behind Kobe and Vince's cousin/former teammate Tracy McGrady. Vince Carter wasn't just any star. He was a sensation in Toronto, the next Michael Jordan. Well, one of the next Michael Jordans. A super athletic, super talented guard who could just dunk like no one else. But he wasn't just a run and dunk man. Air Canada was ahead of his time as a solid three-point shooter. Not counting his final season nor his rookie debut, Vince shot 39% from three on 4 attempts per game, which, considering that this is the early 2000s, that's pretty high volume and efficient at that. There's a reason why he's 9th overall on the NBA's most three-pointers made list. He was talented, he was incredibly popular, and most important of all, he won games for Toronto. While the Raptors never eked out a 50-win season with Vince at the helm, they did make the playoffs twice, technically 3 times, and in 2001, they won their first ever playoff series, a feat which they wouldn't replicate until 2016. And yet, despite the heights reached, despite the popularity, the love that Vince got in Toronto turned to hate pretty quickly.
From North Carolina, 6'6" guard number 15, Vince Carter. And from California, 6'4" guard number 5.
His exit from Toronto is still an all-time breakup in sports, and not in a good way. It was hideous. Uglier than Ben Simmons and Charles Barkley's respective exits from the 76ers. Uglier than Shaq leaving the Magic after they lowballed him, or the breakup between him and Kobe on the Lakers that would follow. Uglier than Kevin Durant joining the 71-3 win team that just beat his own OKC Thunder, a feat for which Durant still gets showered with booze whenever he plays at the Paycom Center, and probably will until the end of his career. Uglier than Bill Walton demanding out of Portland back in the day. Uglier than whichever franchise that James Harden is on and decides to quit on in the next 2 to 3 years. Then again, he's been making it work in LA and they've been surprisingly good without Kawhi, so we'll see. How more can I date this video? None of these compare to all the drama, the rumors, and the definitive actions that Vince Carter took to force his way off of his team. There's a good argument to be made that he was something of a trailblazer for player empowerment. It was largely unseen for a player to force his way off of a team that had recently signed him to a then 6-year max contract. Guys like Kareem and Walton, they were in the last few years of their then current contracts and made it clear that they weren't resigning and wanted out. In the case of Kareem, they at least got something back. In the case of Walton, they didn't. And guys like Kevin Durant and Shaq, they left through free agency, a recent option in NBA history. While the recent retirement ceremony would suggest that these old wounds have healed, or at the very least that MLSE considers it to be financially viable to make this a big event, to this day, Vince's legacy in Toronto can be charitably described as mixed.
I'm going to tell you something. I'm not going to support Vince Carter's jersey being retired, to be honest with you.
All I want to know is, why can't you apologize publicly for how things ended in Toronto? I don't know why we've never heard it. So are you willing to do that?
Part of that is due to said legacy includes how he quit on the Raptors, engaging in some very petty action and inaction during said exit. Refusing to dunk in game and playing dumb with the media.
You used to get to the foul line a lot more. You used to get a lot of dunks inside. I don't want to dunk anymore. We got a lot of people dunking the ball. I just
yeah, but they're not in your league of dunking them.
Nah, thank you, but it's overrated. Dunking's overrated. Would you agree?
No.
It is overrated.
Playing significantly worse than he would after being traded to the Nets.
After scoring just 15.9 points in 20 games with the Raptors, Carter is pouring in over 26 a game with the Nets.
Faking injuries, allegedly, tipping off the opposing team to a play, allegedly, and assaulting his coach. That last one's not an allegation, by the way. Both Carter's mom back in the day and teammate Jalen Rose has spoken about this incident. In the case of J. Rose, he's spoken about it multiple times.
So Vince got this arm underneath their crouch. So now you got them up like this. And if they're kicking and screaming, you won't be able to get them up like Hulk Hogan, but you can still get them down real good. Boom! And ain't nothing you can do about it. And when you get down, it's like...
And this is only scratching the surface. The history behind Vince Carter's exit and the context surrounding his final months with the Raptors could be a video in and of itself.
Do you think Vince Carter has pushed himself as hard as he should have pushed himself?
In years past, no. I was just fortunate enough to have the talent and be able to, you get spoiled when you're able to do a lot of things and you see that and you really don't have to work at it.
Circuit Base has a pretty excellent episode on their beef series about this that I highly recommend checking out, but his exit, to put it bluntly, it set a very unfortunate precedent for the Toronto Raptors. Namely that their stars, they don't stick around. You could argue that this trend began with Damon Stoudemire, the small shoot-first point guard and the first true star of the Canadian expansion teams. Stoudemire, the Raptors' first ever Rookie of the Year, was candid about his future with the Raptors after a failed trade to the Rockets, calling out then GM Glenn Grunwald.
What's going on right now is just a bunch of games, and personally, I don't think he knows what he's doing up there.
Which is why Damon won't re-sign with the Raptors, a decision he's kept to himself, but a decision made the day Grunwald tried to trade him to Houston, then didn't.
I don't think that Glenn has tried to do anything personally, but that's just my opinion. I don't know what goes on. I don't know what he's thinking.
But Stoudemire starting this didn't necessarily mean this had to continue. Vince more or less cemented this precedent of Toronto being something of a farm for the rest of the league in coming years. A place where a star could be born, but not necessarily where they would stick around or succeed for the entirety of their career. Some will blame awful management for their own various pettiness during the breakup. Taking away the parking spot to Carter's mom is generally not the kind of thing that generates goodwill towards your star, but I think there's one thing that, regardless of who you blame more or overall for this breakup, that we can all agree upon. We probably wouldn't feel the way we do about Vince Carter if the trade package for him wasn't historically awful. On December 17th, 2004, this was what the Raptors got out of their franchise star, their most important player up to that date and arguably of all time. The players they got back were Eric Williams and Aaron Williams. They got 2 first-round picks, a 2005 first from the Philadelphia 76ers, and a 2006 first-round pick from the Denver Nuggets. They also technically got Alonzo Mourning, but Mourning never suited up for the Raptors. The official story is that he didn't or wouldn't have been able to pass the team's physical, which, while believable since he did briefly retire at this time due to a life-threatening kidney disease, it kind of raises the question of why the Raptors would go through with a trade where the main name coming back to them wouldn't be able to play for them. That, and it doesn't quite line up with a lot of the original reporting at the time. This old archive article from the NBA official website states that, quote, "The trade is contingent upon exchange players passing physicals." So unless this is an Isaiah Thomas to the Cavs situation where the Raptors were completely negligent when it came to Alonzo's medicals, the more likely, and to be perfectly blunt, believable explanation is that Mourning didn't want to play for Toronto. He had complained a lot about the Nets' decision-making in the prior offseason, and if he was grumpy with the team that made the finals, it's not hard to see him being a distraction on a rebuilding Raptor squad centered around Chris Bosh. That, and they probably didn't want to deal with another headache of a player after getting rid of the contentious Carter in trying to figure out where they could send Mourning to get at least something back for him. They bought out his contract, and Alonzo would sign with the Miami Heat, where he'd be a productive bench player for a couple more years, even winning a championship with them in 2006. As for the other players, there's really not a whole lot to say about them. The Williamses were, well, just look at the stat lines. If that doesn't say it all, then I don't know what will. Neither of them did a thing for the Raptors. Neither of them had any memorable moments on or off the court. Honestly, the only notable thing about either of them is that Eric Williams was moved for Rasho Nesterovic, who became a part of the infamous Jermaine O'Neal trade, where the Raptors packaged him with TJ Ford and the pick that became future All-Star Roy Hibbert. More on that later. Speaking of drafting, the picks that the Raptors acquire would end up being the 16th pick in the 2005 draft and the 20th pick in 2006. Not the worst picks, not the best. However, the Raptors would only end up using one of these picks, that being the 2005 first, in order to select Joey Graham. The other pick, it was moved to dump Jalen Rose's salary and brought back a former Raptor in Antonio Davis, who, to put it mildly, was far removed from his sole All-Star season by the year 2006. Anyway, Joey Graham was okay. It says a lot about how bad the Raptors were drafting from this time period that he was one of the better selections that they made. It was pretty bleak from 2005 onwards. And while it's a bit unfair to have high expectations for the 16th pick in any draft, again, Joey Graham, the two Williams, for Vince Carter. However, even that's not the full account of it. In order for the Raptors to even make the trade happen, they had to waive former 11th overall pick Jerome Moiso. Wasn't picked by the Raptors, but, might as well cover all the bases of the trade while we're here. He wasn't anything special with Toronto or elsewhere for that matter, but it should go to show just how done the Raptors were with Vince at the time. So, yeah, that's the Vince Carter trade. It is a far cry from the value that Vince once commanded. Former GM of the Toronto Raptors, Glenn Grunwald, has said that he was once offered Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash for Vince Carter and Antonio Davis. Davis was a good player, but he was not on Vince's level, so it was very much for Vince Carter. And in hindsight, either one of the returning players would have been better than who the Raptors would end up dealing in such a hypothetical, but that's a what if for another day. Now, a little bit of context as to why this trade was so bad before we get into the scenario. Regardless of whether or not he was faking his injury at the time, Vince did have a history of being injury prone. I did mention that the Raptors made the playoffs 3 times while Vince was with them. That third time he didn't have much of a part in because, well, he had to get surgery on one of his legs. The team rallied at the end of the season and made the postseason, but Vince didn't really participate because, again, injury. Heck, that All-Star year where he got the 3rd most amount of votes? Yeah, as mentioned, he only played about a dozen games between his first absence and being announced as an All-Star starter late January. It was one of the many reasons why the league and media figures like Charles Barkley at the time were pressuring Vince into giving up his starting spot to Michael Jordan, who had made it clear that it was going to be his final season. They felt like Vince hadn't played enough to earn his spot as an All-Star, to which Vince was adamant that the fans had voted for him, only relenting after, of all people, Isaiah Thomas convinced Vince Carter to give it up for Michael Jordan. Yeah, IT, of all people, standing up for Michael Jordan. What a weird timeline. Anyway, his contract was also expensive. $12.6 million doesn't seem like that much. That's a little less than what current Raptor Kelly Olynyk makes right now, but at the time that Vince signed his new deal, that was the maximum that he could have been paid, and while there was a lot of flexibility, aka loopholes when it came to getting a deal done in 2004, that's still a lot of money for one's cap space to be paid to one of your players when they're not an MVP caliber guy. Vince was an All-NBA caliber guy at the time, and he did get a couple of MVP votes in the first season with New Jersey, but even at his peak, he was never that level of player. He wasn't a Kobe or a Dirk. One other thing to keep in mind is that trade packages for star players are not what they used to be, and in a good way for GMs nowadays. The return for a franchise's best has only become more inflated as the years have gone by. Heck, forget 20 years ago. One only needs to look at what the Pacers got for Paul George back in 2017, as opposed to the haul that the Thunder got for him in 2019, for which the Clippers are still paying off the draft capital owed to OKC to this very day, despite the fact that they lost Paul George. That said, this trade, the Vince Carter trade, is still abysmal by every measure. It was underwhelming at the time, and it looks even worse when all was said and done with what little they had gotten. The players they got back didn't give Chris Bosh any help, and the Raptors failed to draft well with the few picks that they got back in order to conscript some young help that could grow alongside CB4. But that's not what we're here to do today. We're here to ask a simple question. Was there any salvaging the Vince Carter trade? Let's put on our GM caps and do a little thought experiment to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this truly terrible trade. Now, I'm gonna set some ground rules before we get started. 1. We are only talking about the players and picks that came as a result of the Vince Carter trade and what can be done with them. So don't expect the Nets in this hypothetical to throw in Nenad Kristic or have him mentioned. Interesting a hypothetical as a backcourt with him and Chris Bosh would have been, assuming he managed to stay healthy anyway. There's a lot of interesting what-ifs for this particular era of the Raptors, mostly due to the amount of misfires management had during the Chris Bosh era. You know how in the early 2010s it felt like the Raptors kept winning with hit after hit in trades and drafting alike? Yeah, the mid to late 2000s were the opposite of that. Virtually every trade was a dud, and aside from Chris Bosh, just about every draft selection they made was a bust, not helped by them missing out on some future Hall of Famers picked right after some of the ones that they selected. But back to the topic at hand. Unless they're related to the return from this trade package right here, we are not talking about them. We are not making this any more complicated than it already will be. Yes, it'd be great if the Raptors drafted LaMarcus Aldridge, but that was their own pick, not the one that they got in the Carter trade, so we're not touching that. There will be some consideration as to whether a given player or pick might affect future drafts, i.e., if the team improves due to a given selection, will they still pick in this or that range, but in terms of changing their other moves, we're not doing that unless it's related to whichever branches grew out from this particular trade tree. And I do mean this trade because we aren't going to be comparing this to other rumored packages that were allegedly on the table or suggested by commentators at the time. We're working with the 2 picks, the 2 Williams, and Alonzo Mourning. This is what we got to work with. With that out of the way, let's see if there's any way we can fix the Vince Carter trade with the power of hindsight. Let's start with the players. Is there anything we could possibly get out of it? No, there's nothing. There is not a single thing. It is not an exaggeration to say that the most notable thing about Eric and Aaron were that they got included in the Vince Carter trade. They were journeymen who bounced around the league before and after ending up in Toronto. Both of them stuck around on the Raptors for a whopping 2 years, where they would be in and out of the lineup, and neither of them would play past 2008. Thus, it's pretty hard to see the Raptors eking out any sort of value in a trade out of either of the Williams. Now, as for Alonzo Mourning, if the Raptors would have exercised some patience, then maybe, again, talking salaries back in the day is a funny thing because Mourning's $5.4 million in the 2004-2005 season seems like pennies nowadays. Just for comparison's sake, Davion Mitchell is on the final year of his rookie deal, and he's making more than that. The difference is that $5.4 million back in 2004 and 2005 is a lot more player salary than it is nowadays due to a significantly smaller salary cap in 2004. For context, teams in 2004 had around $44 million to play around with, and while it didn't have a luxury tax in that particular season, it was around $62 million in the following years. So yeah, it's hard to trade him directly to a team given his own injury history, his then current salary, and the potential for the trade to be torpedoed for him failing to pass a physical exam. So right off the bat, that's 3 players, and the most that one could get out of them is maybe a second rounder. It's pretty disappointing. I tried to find a landing spot for Orlando to get at least something out of the guys in the deal. The Hornets seemed like a fun option since he did start his career there. Maybe he would end it there in this hypothetical, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense given where Charlotte was at the time. However, sometimes the best move to make is no move at all. In this case, you let Aaron and Eric Williams walk, which means you don't trade for Nesterovic, and thus you do not make On June 26, 2008, the Raptors selected Roy Hibbert with the 17th overall pick. A good selection as it would turn out, but as mentioned before, they unfortunately traded his draft rights, TJ Ford, and Raso Nesterovic to the Pacers on July 9th. Remember when I said that every swing the Raptors of this era made was a complete miss? The Jermaine O'Neal trade perfectly encapsulates that. Former All-Star Jermaine O'Neal's tenure with the Raptors was not excellent. He played poorly, and it would take a first-round pick to dump him on the Miami Heat, for which the Raptors at least got back Sean Marion, who they ultimately lost via a sign-and-trade. Yeah, not the greatest move. But since we don't trade one of the Williams for Nesterovic, we aren't going to have him in order to be able to pull off the O'Neal trade. Oh, how sad. Some might argue that this is cheating and that the Raptors could or would still make this trade just with somebody else in the place of Rasho. I say, look, it's my video. I'm going to have some fun with this. Jermaine O'Neal's not going to be a Raptor in this situation. Deal with it. Part of the reason why the Raptors drafted Andrea Bargnani in 2006 over LaMarcus Aldridge was that they wanted someone to play the center position so that Bosh, being the finesse-esque power forward that he was, could play the 4 and not have to worry about banging in the paint and protecting the rim from the likes of Dwight Howard and Yao Ming. Bosh could and would often play the 5, but he was at his best when he was playing the 4 before traditional power forwards more or less became obsolete, and Bosh's evolution was a big part of that, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, you know who was a great center for his time? Roy Hibbert. And in this scenario, Hibbert is going to be a Toronto Raptor. At least when we get to the 2008 draft, because we skipped a couple of them. And just to give you a rundown, Roy Hibbert was one of the better centers of his day, a consistent shot blocker who made all-star appearances and got the nod for All-Defense's second team in 2014. He was conventional as far as centers go, not much of a playmaker nor passer, he didn't put up threes, but he was great at the things you expected your center to do in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So hard to complain about adding that to your team, though this does come with the assumption that the Toronto Raptors managed to develop Hibbert such that he becomes the player that he was in Indiana. We'll get back to the draft in a moment, but let's wrap up the rest of the loose threads from not going through with the O'Neal trade. Because they leave on draft night with merely a future All-Star that would complement Bosh, this also means that the Raptors would keep TJ Ford. Ford was one of the best point guards that Bosh got to play with in Toronto. He did deal with his own share of injuries, that's part of the reason why he was included in the deal in the first place since the Raptors had Jose Calderon, but when he was healthy, TJ could dish up dimes and score with relative ease for a man who was barely 6 feet tall. He's not an all-star or anything, but he was a solid player in his own right, at least when he could play. Again, the man would battle injuries for pretty much his entire career. It's why he ended up in Toronto to begin with. The Milwaukee Bucks more or less gave up on him. Oh, I guess this also means that the Raptors don't get the draft rights to Nathan Jawai, who came back to them in the O'Neal deal. And that's all I have to say about Nathan Jawai because he barely warrants mentioning. One more thing. If Roy Hibbert ends up as a Toronto Raptor and therefore Jermaine O'Neal does not, that also means that the Raptors don't trade away their 2010 pick, and thus they have more draft capital to make a big swing if they want to go all in on this Bosh-led core or simply add another young player to the team that year. Speaking of draft capital, let's talk about... Okay, so this one has a pretty obvious choice. The Raptors originally used this pick to select Joey Graham, an alright selection, chosen one spot ahead of Danny Granger. Yeah, this happened quite a lot during this particular era of Raptors basketball, and you could honestly make a pretty good team simply by selecting the player right after the Raptors draft selections in most of the Bosh era draft classes. Andre Iguodala right after Rafael Urrulo in 2004, LaMarcus Aldridge as mentioned before, and the aforementioned Danny Granger in this year's draft pick. Granger's prime was short-lived due to an injury, but he was an excellent player in Indiana. The archetype of a defensive wing who can knock down threes at a good clip while giving the opposing team's best players hell on the other end. At his peak, he was shooting 40% on 6.7 attempts from 3 and scoring 24 points, all while playing great defense. He was efficient, effective, and on paper, a terrific fit in the front court next to Chris Bosh. He'd be able to take off some of the scoring load that Bosh was almost single-handedly tasked with, as well as giving him further front court tenacity along with Roy Hibbert in a starting lineup. Now, like Roy Hibbert, we are coming in here with the assumption that Danny Granger, a player who would consistently improve year after year, eventually winning Most Improved Player, when that award actually meant something, would see that same sort of progression were he a Toronto Raptor. And that's something that we've taken for granted up to this point because it's going to become incredibly important because of the player that the Raptors can choose in the... Okay, so this is why it gets complicated the further on we get with this thought exercise. Let's assume that the Raptors do draft Danny Granger in 2005. They're probably a better team than they were in 2004 and the team that they were in our timeline, but are they good enough to get out of the lottery and potentially be a low playoff seed team? I'm gonna say no, the Pacers didn't exactly turn things around immediately when Danny Granger was drafted by them. Does that mean that the Raptors still get the first overall pick in this scenario? Toronto only had around an 8% chance of getting it, and yet they ended up with the first overall pick in the 2006 draft. For the sake of not going completely off the rails with this scenario, I'm going to say yes, they still do get the first overall pick, with the caveat that they are still going to draft Andrea Bargnani over LaMarcus Aldridge. A mistake, one that I've repeated a lot in this video, but not the only one related to this draft. As mentioned before, the Raptors had 2 picks in the 2006 draft, as a result of the Carter trade. However, they traded the lesser of the 2, along with Jalen Rose for Antonio Davis. Or rather, the shell of Antonio Davis. It was a cost-saving move and a pretty egregious one at that. In this scenario, since it's related to the Carter trade like the aforementioned Jermaine O'Neal trade, we're not going through with it. Jalen Rose is still a Raptor, and that gives us back the Nuggets pick at 20th. And there's actually a few players we could select. All-Star Paul Millsap is definitely available. Gifted defender, might not have been a volume bucket getter, but even if he wasn't constantly giving you 20, the points that he was putting on the board were efficient. That said, without the benefit of hindsight, picking him 20th is a big stretch. He went 47th for a reason, several reasons actually, not the least of which being his lack of athleticism and being undersized for a power forward in a time where that actually mattered. And speaking of positions, the fit with him and Chris Bosh would be a little awkward. If we weren't confined to the rules of this what if, we could have had the Raptors use that second that they burned on PJ Tucker for Paul, but for this scenario, that second rounder wasn't a part of the Carter trade, so we're moving on. We could go with Rajon Rondo, playoff riser, solid defender, but not necessarily the best shooter, and, well, we've seen what a team led by Rondo would look like when it's not surrounded by the best talent. Obviously in this scenario though, he's not the number one guy, and as a lesser option in the pecking order, he flat out won a championship with the 2008 Celtics. Rondo would be a good choice. However, I do think that there's one option that's just a little bit more fun and a little bit better.
Lowry, half-court heave, a prayer at the buzzer. Kyle Lowry!
Yes, there's a scenario in which the greatest Raptor of all time, Kyle Lowry, started out his career in Toronto. This has a lot of implications way down the line, not the least of which being the fact that the Raptors wouldn't thus trade their 2013 pick in order to acquire Kyle, and thus them being potentially more able to draft Giannis, which Masai Ujiri infamously tried and failed to do on draft night. It's kind of hard to trade into a draft when you don't have a pick within it. Whether or not they do in this scenario is... look, that's a decision which is way down the line, but as far as direct implications go, as far as roster building is concerned, there aren't many better floor generals from this particular era to add alongside Chris Bosh than a prime Kyle Lowry. The keyword being prime. It's important to keep in mind that the Lowry that would stick around in Toronto for 9 seasons, become a perennial all-star, all-NBA player, an NBA championship, and will eventually have his jersey hanging alongside Vince's in the rafters, it wasn't the Lowry that entered into the league, and his reputation as a moody college kid with trouble trusting people, a broken jumper, and health issues.
But the one thing, Dan, that he doesn't do, he doesn't shoot the ball. And I kind of question that a little bit because he is such a gym rat. He loves to play. He's playing all the time. Why isn't he a better shooter? Well, I'll tell you what, he hasn't really worked on it as much as he should.
It's a far cry from the image that the man cultivated in Toronto as one of the team's best shooters ever, a bulldog of a defender, and impeccably intelligent on the court. The thought, the idea of having Kyle Lowry and Chris Bosh on the team at the same time is very intriguing. However, in his early career, Kyle Lowry was a pretty bad shooter, which, while not as big of a concern in the mid to late 2000s as it is nowadays for your point guard or basically any position that's not center, it's still not ideal, and it took a long time for him to become the Kyle Lowry that we all know and love. He was a late bloomer, and if there's one particular knock against picking him over Rondo in this what-if scenario, it's whether or not the Raptors would have had the patience to keep Lowry around long enough for him to become that Lowry, that All-NBA, that All-Star, that champion. It sounds weird. While I have confidence that Roy Hibbert and Danny Granger would hit their respective peaks in Toronto, I'm less certain about that with Lowry due to him being a late bloomer and this particular era of Raptors basketball having very few draft success stories outside of Chris Bosh and eventually DeMar DeRozan. Mainly because the players that they picked for their upside, they never panned out. Raphael in 2005 was a bust, Bargnani in 2006, just how many times have I mentioned LaMarcus Aldridge at this point? The only reason you can't say that they messed up in 2007 was because they traded their first for Lamond Murray a few years back. Show of hands, which one of you remembers who Lamond Murray even was? Me personally, let's be optimistic and say that they do get Kyle Lowry in this draft class 20th, and he does pan out, becoming the all-star caliber guard that he is ahead of schedule. Now you have a core of Kyle Lowry, Chris Bosh, Danny Granger, and Roy Hibbert in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Also, Bargnani's there. I don't know, maybe he comes off the bench. Either way, that's not a bad quartet to have. Plus, you'd have the ever-reliable Jose Calderon coming off the bench, and, if he's healthy, TJ Ford. Would they win a championship? Maybe. They'd certainly be competitive in a weak Eastern Conference, and the Raptors could certainly make further trades to shore up the roster. They attempted to do just that in our timeline with the Jermaine O'Neal trade. If nothing else, I do think that the team is in a good enough state that Chris Bosh probably doesn't leave in free agency like he did in our timeline, which in and of itself is a fascinating scenario. Does this mean that Dwayne Wade and LeBron James joined Derrick Rose in Chicago like it was originally rumored, but then Luol Deng apparently caused that to be blown up? Who knows? In any case, getting Kyle Lowry and Danny Granger for Vince Carter? Yeah, it doesn't seem so bad. There is a world in which the Vince Carter trade doesn't seem so terrible. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. I've been thinking about this particular trade for a while, and what's got it on my mind was a somewhat recent breakup of another Toronto star with their team, and the contrast in how their trade has panned out in comparison to how the one with Vince did.
So Pascal Siakam gets traded by the Toronto Raptors, and in return, Toronto getting Bruce Brown, Jordan Nwora, Kyra Lewis, and 3 first-round picks.
On January 17th, 2024, wow, it was the 17th as well? That's interesting. The Toronto Raptors sent out 2-time All-NBA, All-Star, and NBA champion Pascal Siakam to the Indiana Pacers for 3 first-round picks, Kyra Lewis Jr., Jordan Nwora, and Bruce Brown. They also got a $10 million trade exception out of this, but yeah, that is kind of pathetic. 2 of those picks were in the same year and in a draft that everyone is calling the worst one since 2000, if not worse than 2000, and the 1 pick from outside that year was expected to align with Tyrese Halliburton's prime, so this looked like pennies on the dollar considering the talent that Siakam was and still is. Like the Vince Carter trade, there is context that informs why the trade was so underwhelming, such as Pascal's agent telling other teams that he did not want to be traded, that his preference was to stay in Toronto, let him choose where he wanted to go. And thus teams didn't want to give up a haul for a player that didn't necessarily want to stick with them in the long term, being a rental. But it doesn't change what the Raptors got, and it doesn't make the return any better. You still got 2 bad draft picks in a weak draft. None of the players you got back seem like they're going to stick around in the long run, and who knows where that 2026 pick is going to be. And yet, the current front office, run by Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster, made moves to improve both the team at the time, as well as the overall return. The worst of those picks were packaged up with the juniors, Otto Porter and Kyra Lewis, for a younger player in Ochai Agbaji, and the veteran stretch big that is Kelly Olynyk. Kelly Olynyk's been solid. Ochai didn't look too great last season or in Summer League, but his development in 2024 is a triumph. It's one of the few bright spots for a Raptors team currently riddled with injuries. They even got something out of that puny trade exception. Davion Mitchell isn't an amazing player, but his point of attack defense is phenomenal, and he's a reliable backup guard. And I'll say this for D-Mitch 2.0, he's not Jalen McDaniels, one of the worst players to ever put on a Raptors uniform, and who the team essentially dumped on the Kings in that very same deal. They even got a valuable Blazers second for this year out of it, and Jamal Shead, who's been pretty decent as a rookie.
Hey bro, you just got traded to the Kings. You was dead at me? You did. Me? Yes, you!
Speaking of rookies, the jury's still out on Jacoby Walter, though he is showing a lot of promise as a two-way guard, and we still don't know what's going to happen with Bruce Brown, but as of right now, the trade looks significantly better than it did the day the news dropped. Managing a sports team is a lot like cooking a meal. Good management can take some pretty mediocre ingredients and still make something edible out of it. And that's exactly what Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster have done with the scraps that they ultimately got from the Siakam trade. The Babcock front office was dealt a similar hand of ingredients via the Carter trade, but they proceeded to burn the pan and then the whole kitchen. If the end result of the Vince Carter trade brought in the likes of Danny Granger and Kyle Lowry, with both still achieving the heights they did at the peaks alongside Chris Bosh, the Vince Carter trade would be viewed as a painful but necessary decision to transition into a new era of Raptors basketball. Instead, it's a travesty. This isn't some hindsight like the Utah Jazz missing out on Magic Johnson scenario. It looked bad at the time, and the subsequent decision-making only served to make it even more grotesque with each failure of a move made by the then Babcock-led front office. In the end, the Vince Carter trade is a testament to how important competence is for a front office in a team's success, and how poor management can make a bad situation worse. Vince Carter is certainly not blameless in the falling out, and his refusal to apologize or accept blame for how things ended still irks a lot of Raptors fans, myself included, but I do think that a lot of how we feel about Air Canada is, in some manner, the result of this horrendous trade. And had it turned out differently, we might not necessarily have had the same contentious reaction to Vince Carter's jersey being announced as the first to be retired. That's all for this time, everyone. Thank you for watching and celebrating this very strange anniversary with me. Until next time, game on, my friends.